The vast chamber stretched farther than the eye could see, its ceiling lost in a haze of shifting light that poured from machines humming in silence. Tall pillars rose high, carved from black stone, and etched with glowing alien symbols, each line pulsing with energy. The floor itself reflected like polished glass, and in its reflection the children saw not only themselves but also the weight of the empire that surrounded them. The air was heavy, carrying the faint metallic scent of machinery, mixed with the distant fragrance of burning incense meant to hide the coldness of the place. The 20 children stood together, some holding hands tightly, some staring down at the ground, while others fixed their eyes defiantly on the rows of alien seats that spiraled up around them. Guards of the Empire, clad in silver armor, lined the platform, each one silent, unmoving yet radiating menace from the rifles cradled in their arms. The guards' eyes glowed faintly from behind helmets, giving them the appearance of soulless machines, though the children knew well enough that these men were human-born but loyal to no one except the Emperor. Above the stage hung a massive holographic display showing their faces one by one, rotating slowly so that the entire audience could take a long look at what was about to be sold. The images were surrounded by glowing numbers, placeholders for the bids that would soon be shouted across the hall. The crowd arrived in waves, their steps echoing across the chamber. Creatures of every imaginable form gathered, some tall and thin, with glassy skin that shimmered like water, some short and scaled with eyes that blinked from the sides of their heads. Cloaked figures with claws and tendrils shuffled into seats, their voices whispering in strange tones. The auction was considered one of the greatest spectacles of the season. Rare human children from a distant and rebellious planet displayed for wealth and power to fight over. Yet while the audience murmured with excitement, none of them noticed the faint unease in the children, for despite their fear there was something strange about the way they stood together. They were not entirely broken, they were not entirely conquered. There was a unity in their glances, as if each child knew a truth that the Empire and its alien bidders could not yet imagine. The announcer, a tall figure wrapped in crimson robes, stepped forward, his voice amplified by invisible speakers. He spoke in a slow, steady rhythm, welcoming the honored guests, praising the strength of the Empire, and declaring that these children were symbols of victory and trophies of conquest. His words drew cheers from the seats. Banners of the Empire unfurled above, and the holograms grew brighter, but still the children stood unmoving, their breaths shallow but steady, their eyes flickering toward the massive doors at the far end of the hall, as though waiting for something unseen, as though time itself was counting down to a moment that would change everything forever. Alien bidders crowded in, each with greedy eyes, believing they would soon own rare children from a distant world. The seats that rose in tiers around the hall filled quickly with beings from across the Empire, each creature bringing with them the weight of their wealth and their hunger for power. Some leaned forward with sharp grins, others kept still, their expressions masked but their eyes burning with desire for the human children displayed on the stage. The chatter grew louder, blending into 1,000 tongues, each voice weaving through the air, creating a storm of anticipation. Among them sat merchants dressed in layered robes, heavy with gold chains, their fingers twitching over glowing tablets as they calculated values of ownership. Beside them were warlords, their armor dented and scarred from campaigns, yet polished just enough to catch the light, each one flanked by silent guards who held jagged weapons carved from bone. In the upper balconies, nobles, draped in shimmering fabrics, reclined, lazily sipping luminous drinks, their gazes sharp and judging as they whispered about how the children might serve as symbols of prestige or bargaining chips in political games. Stranger still were the bidders, who were not human at all, tall thin creatures with skin that pulsed faintly as if rivers of light ran beneath the surface, raised their translucent hands, their long fingers twitching in excitement. Reptilian beings with coiled tails tapped the edges of their seats, their forked tongues sliding out as they hissed among themselves. Mechanical figures shaped like men, yet moving too precisely, sat silently, their glowing eyes locked on the stage, as if assessing the worth of flesh through the cold logic of machine. Murmur of the crowd rose when the holographic images of the children shifted, the faces enlarging one after another, the numbers flickering beside them, flashing brighter with each new potential bid. Whispers ran through the seats about the rarity of such a collection, whispers of bloodlines, strength, intelligence, all compressed into the form of these 20 trembling figures standing in a line. None of the bidders knew their names, none cared about their pasts. To them they were property, nothing more. And yet, as the children felt the eyes of the crowd upon them, there was no collapse into despair. Instead, their small shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, as though something within them called for defiance. One boy clenched his fists. Though he was barely more than 10, his jaw tightened, and the guard nearest him shifted. Uneasily, another child, a girl with hair falling across her face, slowly raised her head, meeting the gaze of a bidder in the front row, and the alien flinched, looking away with an expression that betrayed confusion. The auctioneer lifted his hands, commanding silence. His voice filled the chamber, resonating from every wall. He praised the generosity of the guests. He spoke of the Empire's unmatched conquest, of distant worlds. He declared that the children before them represented not weakness, but trophies to be claimed and owned. The crowd erupted again, some shouting impatiently for the first bid to begin, others already flashing signals of wealth into the glowing air. But, hidden in the crowd, away from the eyes of the guards, sat a figure cloaked in shadow, silent and still, unlike the rest. This one did not shift or whisper or raise a hand. Their eyes glowed faintly as they studied the children, and, for a moment, one child looked back, their gaze locking across the distance, as if they knew that this presence was not here to bid but to reveal what no one else in the chamber yet understood. The children exchanged nervous glances, knowing a secret no one else in the room yet understood. They stood close together beneath the weight of thousands of watching eyes, the glow of the holograms painting their faces in shifting shades of blue and gold. Some children trembled, their breaths shallow, as if the pressure of the Empire itself pressed down upon them. Others bit their lips, holding back the fear that threatened to spill across their expressions. But through it all, there was something strange in the way they looked to one another, a rhythm of understanding passing silently between them like a language without words. One boy, no older than 12, turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting those of the girl beside him, and without a sound she nodded. It was the smallest gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching, yet it carried a strength that steadied him. Another child at the far end of the line caught the exchange and passed it on, a chain reaction spreading through the group until every one of the 20 children shared in the same unspoken bond. The guards shifted uneasily, for though the children remained silent and still, there was an aura building among them, something that did not belong to captives. They were to calm, to connected, as though they were waiting not for the mercy of the Empire, but for the arrival of something far greater. The crowd did not notice at first. They were too consumed with their own greed, too busy whispering about bids and wealth. Yet slowly a tension grew. In the chamber, certain bidders leaned forward, their alien senses catching faint traces of the energy moving through the group. The whispers faltered, and for the first time, silence brushed against the noise. The auctioneer noticed as well, his crimson robe shimmering under the lights as he tilted his head curiously at the line of children. His words faltered for only a breath before he raised his voice again, attempting to drown the growing unease with more praise for the Empire and more promises of glory to those who would claim ownership. But the calm strength of the children gnawed at the edges of his performance. One of the youngest, a boy with hair like fire and eyes bright with defiance, stepped slightly forward, his small hand reaching back to grasp that of the child behind him. Together, they stood firmer as though rooted to the ground, and the others followed until the line of 20 no longer looked like a group of frightened captives, but like a formation held together by something deeper than chains. Whispers spread through the crowd, now more urgent. What was this defiance? Why did these children not break the way others had broken? Before questions swirled among bidders who suddenly felt the weight of doubt pressing into their greedy thoughts. And high above in the shadows, the cloaked figure still watched, unblinking and patient, the faint glow of their eyes fixed not on the Empire, not on the audience, but solely on the children who now stood bound by their secret, as though waiting for the moment when truth would burn through the illusion and tear the silence of the hall apart. As the auctioneer raised his voice, the crowd shouted bids louder and louder, filling the chamber with chaos. The chamber roared alive as voices clashed against one another, each louder than the last, alien tongues twisting through the air while glowing symbols of currency flashed across the walls. The bidding had begun, and the Empire reveled in the storm of greed. Merchants raised jeweled hands, signaling wealth without hesitation. Warlords pounded their fists on the rails, demanding recognition. Nobles leaned lazily in their seats, letting servants lift glowing cards on their behalf, each bid climbing higher, faster with every breath. The Auctioneer stood at the center, his crimson robe rippling with each wave of sound, his amplified voice carried above the noise, praising every new bid, as though it were a hymn to the empire. He called out numbers that spun across the holograms, glowing brighter, until the faces of the children were swallowed by the rising tide of value. Yet even as he glorified the spectacle, there was a tremor in his tone, for he felt the chaos around him shifting into something more dangerous. The children stood motionless, but inside their hearts raced the noise of the hall, pressed against them like a storm. Yet none lowered their heads, none bent beneath the weight of the bidding. Their eyes darted toward one another, the silent bond stronger. Now, as if every shouted number only hardened their defiance, one boy clenched his fists so tightly the skin of his knuckles paled. A girl in the center closed her eyes and whispered something unheard. A name perhaps, or a prayer. The bidders cared for none of it. They shouted over each other, driven wild by competition. A reptilian creature with scales glistening like oil hissed as it raised the price again, its forked tongue tasting the air nearby. A noble woman adorned in silver chains laughed as she outbid him, her gaze sharp as she imagined the prestige that ownership would bring. Still higher the numbers climbed like a fire raging beyond control, and then, without warning, the storm faltered. One child, a girl with dark eyes, stepped forward, her chin lifted, her small voice carrying in a tone that cut strangely through the chaos. Though none in the audience understood the words, her defiance rippled like a wave. Silence spread for a heartbeat, then the shouting returned louder and angrier than before. But beneath the noise, unease grew. The auctioneer raised both arms, demanding order, his voice strained, as he declared that such behavior meant nothing, that the children were still property. Yet his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The crowd shouted louder still, some bidding wildly, others demanding answers. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons, their armor humming faintly in the electric air. The shadows, the cloaked figure leaned forward, the glow of their eyes brighter now, as if stirred by the storm erupting across the chamber. The children saw it too, and for the first time they allowed themselves a flicker of hope, for they knew the moment of revelation was drawing closer. With every furious shout, every desperate bid, until the entire hall seemed ready to shatter beneath the weight of secrets still hidden. Then one child whispered a name, and the entire group stood taller, as if a hidden power was awakening. The whisper was faint, carried only to the ears of those standing close, yet it spread through the line of children like fire through dry grass, each face lifting, each pair of eyes brightening with a light that no fear could dim. The guards did not hear the name, nor did the auctioneer, who was too busy calling bids higher and higher, but the children heard it, and it filled them with something they had been waiting for since the moment they were taken, something that gave them strength in the middle of the Empire's spectacle. The girl who whispered the name held herself straighter, her shoulders squared, her small hand tightening into a fist. The boy beside her repeated the name under his breath, his voice low but firm. Then another child spoke it, and another, until the entire group murmured the same word, their voices so soft they barely disturbed the air, yet the sound wove itself together, forming a current that could not be ignored. They did not shout, they did not scream, they simply breathed the name as though it was part of them. The audience began to sense it. Though they did not know what the children said, they felt the change in the air. The murmurs across the rows shifted into uneasy whispers. Aliens, with sharpened senses, twitched their ears. Mechanical beings tilted their heads, as if analyzing an unknown frequency. Even the nobles grew restless, tugging at their robes as though uncomfortable in their own skins. The children were not acting like captives, and that truth gnawed at the crowd like an itch they could not scratch. The auctioneer tried to press forward, his voice booming louder than before. He declared that the first child was now open for claim. His hands spread wide as the glowing numbers surged across the walls, but his words fell strangely hollow, as though the chamber itself had grown resistant to his authority. The crowd shouted their bids, but the rhythm faltered, some voices breaking, others trailing away mid-number, and for the first time hesitation entered the hall. The guards noticed the shift. They tightened their grips on weapons. They stepped closer to the line of children, the hum of their armor growing louder, but none of the children flinched. Instead, they held to the name, their eyes bright, their posture firm, as though the word itself shielded them from fear. High above, the cloaked figure watched with unbroken focus, the faint glow in their eyes pulsing faintly in rhythm with the whispers on the stage. They leaned forward, their hands resting lightly on the rail, as though ready to rise at any moment, and even though the children could not see through the shadows, they felt it, a connection invisible, yet undeniable, The Empire had built this hall to showcase power, to display conquest, and to strip away hope. Yet now, before the eyes of thousands, the illusion cracked, for the whisper of a single name carried more weight than all the riches shouted into the air. And though no one yet understood why, the crowd knew that something dangerous had awakened, and the storm inside the chamber was only beginning. The doors of the hall burst open, and figures cloaked in shadow entered, their presence heavy like storms. The thunder of the auctioneer's voice faltered as the great doors at the far end of the chamber cracked open, the sound of grinding metal echoing like rolling thunder. The crowd fell silent, for only the Empire itself held the authority to interrupt an auction, and yet no command had been given from above. The guards nearest the entrance snapped their rifles into position, their glowing visors narrowing as they prepared to face whatever dared intrude upon the sanctity of the hall. A cold wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and iron. The banners of the Empire rippled high above, as though struck by an unseen force. The lights that had glowed so proudly across the walls flickered, once dimming before flaring back to life, and in the heavy silence shapes emerged from the doorway, tall and imposing, wrapped in long cloaks that trailed across the polished floor. Each step measured, each movement slow but carrying a weight that bent the air itself. Audience shifted in their seats, their voices reduced to uneasy murmurs. Nobles clutched their goblets tighter. Merchants leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Warlords rested their hands on their weapons, unsure whether to laugh or to prepare for battle. Alien bidders hissed and clicked their tongues, their senses alert to the power radiating from the newcomers. No one knew their names, but everyone felt the danger in their presence. There were 5 figures at first, then 7, then more, the cloaks concealing faces but revealing enough to unsettle the crowd. Some were broad-shouldered, their movements heavy like soldiers forged in endless war. Others were lean with the quiet grace of assassins. Each of them carried an aura of purpose, a storm hidden beneath silence. They did not hurry, yet with every step closer the chamber grew colder. The auctioneer swallowed hard, his words stumbling. From his lips he demanded that the intruders reveal themselves, that they explain their presence in the sacred hall. But his voice cracked, despite the amplification and the authority. He claimed his commands carried no weight, for none of the cloaked figures slowed there. Advanced, the guards raised their rifles. The hum of energy charging filled the air, but before they could give warning, one of the children stepped forward, his face breaking into a smile, the first smile seen since the auction began. The guards hesitated, confusion slipping through their training. The boy lifted his chin and whispered the same name the others had repeated before, and as if on cue the cloaked figures stopped. The silence deepened, so thick that the breath of every living being in the hall seemed caught in their throat. And then the tallest of the cloaked strangers reached up slowly, lowering his hood. The light struck his face, sharp features hardened by battle, eyes burning with fire and recognition. Gasps spread like wildfire through the audience, for though most did not know him, those who did understood instantly that the Empire had not expected this. The children did not tremble. They did not fear. Their backs straightened as though the weight of chains had lifted in that moment, for their fathers had come, and the Empire's illusion of control was crumbling. Whispers spread across the crowd. Who are they? Why do the children smile now when moments ago they trembled? The chamber, that only moments before had been filled with the roar of bidding, now pulsed with confusion and fear. The audience leaned toward one another, speaking in urgent tones, their voices overlapping into 1,000 fragments. Who are they? Where did they come from? Why do the children look at them with such hope? The questions raced from row to row, and even the alien bidders, whose senses often dulled to human emotions, now felt the undeniable shift that had taken root across the stage. Nobles whispered into jeweled hands, their eyes darting from the cloaked figures to the children, their polished arrogance cracking into unease. Merchants shuffled in their seats, running trembling fingers across glowing tablets, no longer calculating profits but instead trying to understand whether they had been drawn into something greater than trade. The warlords shifted impatiently, their armored fists clenching as they debated whether to see these intruders as threats or as challenges worthy of battle. Cloaked figures stood still, their presence heavy, their faces shadowed but their eyes burning. The children saw them clearly, and for the first time since their capture they lifted their heads with confidence. They smiled, small, subtle smiles that carried the weight of truth, the kind of smiles that told the audience the auction no longer belonged to the Empire. One boy leaned forward, his hands no longer trembling, his eyes bright as stars. He stared directly at the crowd, as though daring them to ask again, "Who are they?" Another girl with braids tumbling over her shoulders lifted her chin, the faintest laugh escaping. Her lips, not of mockery but of relief, as if a burden had been lifted from her chest. The guards felt it to their rifles, still raised, but their arms, heavy, their armor humming uncertainly. One looked to the auctioneer for guidance, but the man in crimson robes had lost his voice. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His authority stripped away by the simple presence of those who had entered without fear. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into gasps. Some of the audience began to rise from their seats, preparing to flee, sensing danger that their greed could not outweigh others, leaned forward, unwilling to look away, desperate to uncover the truth of who these strangers were, why the children stood taller, why the very air itself seemed to bend around them. The cloaked figures said nothing, but their silence was more powerful than words. Their very stillness was a declaration that they were not here as bidders, not as guests, not as subjects of the empire. They were here for something greater. The children exchanged glances once more, their bond unbroken, their smiles spreading across the line, and though they did not speak aloud, the meaning was clear. Their fathers had come, and the empire would soon learn what that truly meant. The cloaked figures removed, their hoods revealing fathers, known as legendary warriors, rulers and rebels feared across Galaxista. Silence cracked like thunder, as one by one the strangers lifted their hoods, the dim light of the hall striking their faces and sending ripples of recognition through the audience. The first was a warrior, his skin marked with scars earned in battles. Fought across stars, his armor hidden beneath the cloak, but the glint of steel at his side enough to remind all who watched of his countless victories. He lifted his gaze, steady, unflinching, and those who remembered his campaigns whispered his name in fear beside him. Another lowered his hood, revealing not the face of a soldier but of a ruler, his crown forged from black crystal resting against his brow, his eyes carrying the calm authority of a man who had bent systems to his will. With nothing but words, the nobles in the upper balconies gasped, recognizing treaties broken by his hand, alliances reshaped by his cunning. Yet here he stood, not as a sovereign but as a father. A third man revealed himself, his face young yet hard, his reputation that of a rebel, whose name was spoken in hushed tones in the Empire's records. His cloak fell to reveal tattoos etched across his arms, each one a story of uprisings and fires kindled against imperial chains. The merchants in the crowd trembled, for they remembered the loss of trade routes and supply lines. Whenever his shadow passed, he met their eyes with quiet defiance. The fourth figure pulled back his hood, revealing features weathered by time and hardship. A man who carried the wisdom of survival through countless wars. He was no king, no general, no famed leader. Yet his presence carried weight greater than any title, for he was known as a ghost, a man who had vanished and returned again and again. Impossible to kill, impossible to control. The guards shifted uneasily, recognizing stories they had once dismissed as myth. Finally, the tallest of them all lowered his hood, his eyes burning brighter than the others, his very presence pulling the air tighter as if the hall itself bent around him. His face was not only known but feared, for he was the warlord who had once stood against the empire and lived his survival alone, was legend, his defiance etched into every scar across his body. And now he stood not as a conqueror, not as a rebel, but as a father whose child stood on that stage. The children no longer trembled, they stood proud, their eyes shining as they looked upon the men who had come for them. The bond between them and their fathers lit the chamber with a force no wealth could purchase, no empire could break. The audience recoiled, some gasping, others whispering frantically. The empire had not captured nameless children, they had stolen heirs of power, warriors, bloodlines, rulers, rebels, and legends. Every bid, every number shouted before now turned meaningless, for no coin could claim what already belonged to destiny. In that moment, the chamber that had once been a marketplace became a battlefield waiting for the first strike. Silence gripped the empire, for they realized too late they had not been selling children. They had been challenging bloodlines that could shatter thrones. The chamber hung, frozen, the roar of greed that once shook its walls now replaced by a silence so sharp it cut through every breath. Nobles stared wide-eyed, their jeweled hands trembling. Merchants clutched at glowing tablets that now seemed useless, their numbers meaningless. Warlords shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their armored hands twitching toward weapons they suddenly realized would not be enough. The alien bidders hissed low, their tongues recoiling, their eyes darting toward the exits, as if the walls themselves had become a trap. The auctioneer stood paralyzed, crimson robes, heavy as chains, his voice gone, his throat dry. He had shouted numbers with pride. He had praised the empire with devotion, but now he saw only the truth, that these were not prizes to be sold. They were heirs, each one carrying the blood of men whose names were spoken with dread across galaxies. The guards hesitated, their rifles raised, but their arms shook. None dared take the first shot, for to fire upon the children now was to invite the wrath of the fathers who stood like storm clouds ready to break open the moment a spark was struck. The children stepped forward, no longer a line of captives but a formation, their eyes locked on their fathers, their smiles faint but certain. The name they had whispered earlier now rang inside them like a drumbeat, uniting them as one. The crowd saw it, and they understood the truth. The Empire had tried to cage lightning, and now the storm was about to be unleashed. One of the fathers, the scarred warrior, raised his hand slowly, not in threat but in declaration. The crowd gasped as his voice thundered through the chamber. He spoke only a few words, words that every translator device struggled to keep up with, but the meaning was clear. These are mine. You cannot own what already belongs to destiny. Ruler beside him lifted his chin, his eyes sweeping across nobles who once believed themselves powerful. Their faces paled, for they knew that a single decree from him could unravel entire alliances. He spoke softly, yet the hall trembled under the weight of his calm warning. The rebel laughed, the sound sharp and fearless. His words were fire, promising that any hand raised against the children would burn. His defiance, so familiar, so dreaded, made the merchants bow their heads, for they had felt his fury before. The ghosts said nothing, yet the silence he carried was louder than battle drums. It told of survival against impossible odds. It told of a man who would not stop until every chain was broken. And the warlord stepped forward, his eyes blazing as he stared down the guards who dared to stand before his child. The hall shook with every step he took until he stood at the center of the storm. His voice, a growl that needed no translation, touched them, and the Empire falls. The silence that followed was absolute. None dared to breathe, none dared to move. The Empire had tried to sell children, but in truth it had called forth kings, rebels and warriors whose bloodlines could unmake empires with a single command. And in that final moment the auction was over, not with a bid, not with a sale, but with the quiet realization that the Empire itself had placed its throne on the edge of a blade.